Hello, and welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I've been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are here to continue to march forward through another offseason together. As always, you guys can always find our 100% free, 24/7, boots on the ground coverage of the Jacksonville Jaguars when you find us at social media such as Facebook and Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Today, we are going to talk about my quarter-century all-Jaguars offense list. Now, this list is out on the site. You will at least see it some point early in the day on Friday. I'm not going to go over my reasoning for every single guy I picked, etc. But I do want to spend at least this podcast, something I don't get to do in the article, and talk about the guys who just missed. So this is an all-quarter century, all offense. When I say quarter century, so this is only since the year 2000. So there are some guys like, for example, Tony Boselli isn't that left tackle. He only played 19 games this century. He played 16 games in 2000 and I believe 3 games in 2001, something along those lines. Jimmy Smith, on the other hand, was extremely productive in the 2000s. Had, I believe, 4 1,000-yard seasons, including 1,000-yard seasons in each of his last 2 years in the NFL. Really an incredible way to go out for Jimmy. So I just want that to be the context. So just some of the guys I think we can talk about in today's episode are guys who maybe just missed the mark, etc. So I will say that looking through this offense, it's pretty much all the early 2000s. There's only one guy, well, 2 guys really, who played after 2010 extensively. 3 guys overall, Maurice Jones-Drew, but that obviously wasn't for many seasons in the 2000s. In terms of guys drafted after 2010, it's only Allen Robinson. You also have Marcedes Lewis in there in terms of guys who played in the 2010s. But this is a lot of the early 2000s, especially the offensive line, completely dominated in that regard. And there were some Jaguars offensive linemen who I considered who have played since then. The main 4 really. Eugene Monroe at left tackle. I think that Eugene Monroe had at least an argument to make against Khalif Barnes, but ultimately you look at what each one brought to the table for the Jaguars, I think that you go ahead and give Barnes the nod, simply because he was looking at some of the metrics, some of the things that I take heavily into account, such as approximate value from Pro Football Reference. Barnes was simply, ahead of him and by a little bit. So part of that, obviously, Monroe only played 5 games, etc. But Monroe was very close with Khalif Barnes at left tackle. I think that looking at center, this one wasn't close because Brad Meester is the second best offensive lineman to ever play in franchise history. Arguably a top 10 player in franchise history. He's only behind Tony Boselli in terms of offensive linemen who have played for them. He's the clear best center in franchise history. One of the best overall players, like I said, one of the best offensive players, etc. Brandon Linder, however, was a dang good center in his own right. And I think had his career gone for a few more years, maybe you see him kind of push, Brad Meester. So obviously, Brandon Linder said goodbye to the game, when he did. But I think he at least deserves to be mentioned on this list. Linder, for my money, is the best Jaguars offensive lineman since, Meester walked away. And that's including, some big investments at left tackle, some big investments at guard, especially in free agency. I mean, Zane Beadles, Andrew Norwell, Brandon Sheriff. Sheriff was the third guy, I at least thought about at right guard. Sheriff had brought some really good snaps to Jacksonville. But overall, and you'll see in a lot of these, I went with experience and longevity, I think, played a big role. Because you don't also want to give recency bias. You don't want to give some guys the nod just because they're the most recent guy of significance to play at that spot. So while I think Brandon Sheriff obviously had a good run in Jacksonville as the right guard, I ultimately went with somebody who was in Jacksonville for more than 3 seasons that Brandon Sheriff, was there. So I think right tackle between Maurice Williams and Jawan Taylor, I think is a legit conversation. I think, Jawan Taylor spent 4 years with the franchise and then left after his rookie deal. You look at on the other side, Maurice Williams had a pretty extended stay with the Jaguars. Played 9 years with the team. Over, 100 career starts for the franchise. So that's why I kind of went with that. But I do think Jawan Taylor should at least be mentioned. Because he was a quality player during his 4 years in Jacksonville. His last year especially was, an incredibly solid season. He was a good player in Jacksonville, was a part of a playoff run, etc. So I do think he should at least be, potentially mentioned. But ultimately, I do give Maurice Williams that nod. Tight end, Mercedes Lewis holds so many of the franchise's records, receiving-wise, at tight end. Obviously, Evan Ingram did a lot of good for the Jaguars at the position over his 3 years at the franchise. Obviously, really good 2022 and 2023 seasons. That 2023 season, just in terms of volume and the consistent, safety blanket that he was and the toughness that he showed. One of the best individual seasons in franchise history. I do think, though, Mercedes Lewis gets the edge by a good bit. And again, it's kind of what I've been mentioning. It's that longevity. It's that consistency. And that's maybe something you haven't seen with the Jaguars a lot recently, which I think is a big reason why, most of this list is guys who were able to stick around with the team because the team wasn't facing a reset every couple of years. After that transition from Coughlin to Jack Del Rio, it was pretty consistent in terms of who was there and the guys who were staying. And then after him, you get Mike Mularkey. You get Gus Bradley pretty quickly after that. You get Doug Marrone. You get Urban Meyer. You get Doug Peterson right after Urban Meyer. And now you have, obviously, Liam Cohen. So it's a lot of moving pieces, etc. Receiver was interesting. Jimmy Smith, like I said, you obviously have to give Jimmy Smith a spot. Jimmy Smith's run in just the 2000s alone would have made him the best wide receiver in franchise history. I mean, some of the numbers he put up to end his career. He wasn't a guy who left the game with his production declining. He left the game on top. An absolute stud. For my money, the 3 best players in Jaguars history are Tony Boselli, Fred Taylor, and Jimmy Smith. And you can arrange it really however you want to, but those are the 3 to me. And I think when you look beyond Jimmy Smith, obviously there's been a lot of questions. Keenan McCardell, another case of kind of using the century mark. He only played 2 seasons of the century with the Jaguars, etc., but still obviously deserves being mentioned. Allen Robinson, other than Jimmy Smith, Allen Robinson was pretty far and away the most productive receiver the Jaguars have had in the 2000s. You would expect Brian Thomas to pretty quickly enter that conversation. Because, again, Allen Robinson, another guy who didn't stick with the team. Only really 3 years with the Jaguars. His 4th year, obviously the ACL injury in week 1 and the infamous tap on the knee. I mean, Allen Robinson was a legit number 1 receiver. But I think give Brian Thomas Jr. a couple more seasons and you can put him on that list. And we'll see. Travis Hunter can have a couple more seasons. Maybe Brian Thomas Jr. can stack, 4, 5, 6 seasons, become a perennial Pro Bowl, All-Pro type guy past Jimmy Smith. And then Travis Hunter is passing Allen Robinson. And then going for that same spot that, obviously, Brian Thomas and Jimmy Smith are at. So there's a lot of things to be excited, I think, for Jacksonville. You have guys who you can see become potential guys at this pick, like Trevor Lawrence. You could have gone with Blake Bortles or David Garrard at this spot. It was tough. I felt like I didn't give anybody the legacy nod other than Mark Brunell, but it was just tough for me to say any other quarterback, you really think of the century of the Jaguars. despite others playing more games than he did and producing more than he did, were more of the face of the Jaguars of that century. If that makes sense. If it doesn't, then it's my list. That's what I think about that. So thank you guys for joining me for today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. Please do not forget to like, subscribe, download, whatever you have to do on Apple Podcasts and on other podcast platforms.